All right, let's start with the basics. Verifications are really important in public housing and housing choice voucher programs. They make sure that tenant income, deductions, and household circumstances are properly documented. This isn't just about following the rules. It helps us prevent fraud, make sure subsidies are allocated correctly, and stay compliant with HUD regulations. So, think of it like an essential safeguard for the whole system. Now, when we talk about HUD verification requirements, there are a few key areas we need to focus on. First, reported family income. All sources of income must be verified through third parties. For example, we can't just take the tenant's word for it. We need proof from employers or other reliable sources. Next, value of assets. It's not just about income, but assets too. Things like bank accounts, cars, or properties. We need to verify these as well. Then, we have deduction expenses. Anything that reduces income, like childcare expenses or medical bills, must be verified. Lastly, adjusted income factors. These are things that could affect a tenant's adjusted income, like allowances or special circumstances. They all need verification too. When we're verifying information, it's important to use the right methods. There's a hierarchy, starting with the most reliable and moving down to the least. The top level is upfront income verification, UIV, using HUD's IVE system. This is the most reliable method and it's mandatory. Then, if we can't use HUD's IVE system, we might use non-HUD systems for verification. This is optional but still highly effective. Written third-party verification comes next. This is also mandatory and involves getting information in writing from a third party, like an employer or government agency. Sometimes, if we can't get written verification, we might have to use a third-party form. This is still considered pretty reliable, but it's not as strong as the first two methods. Then we have oral third-party verification, which is used when we can't get anything in writing. It's not as solid as written verification, but it's better than nothing. And finally, we have tenant declarations. This is basically the tenant telling us their information. It's the least reliable, so we only use it when no other verification method is available. Keeping track of verification documentation is just as important as the verification process itself. Here's what we need to do. We start with personal declarations. These are completed by the family when they're applying for eligibility or during recertifications. Then, we need third-party verification. This can be either written or oral verification from an outside source. It's also crucial to retain all of this documentation. Document retention means keeping all the forms and supporting documentation for at least 3 years. Finally, there might be times when we can't get third-party verification. In those cases, we can use alternative methods, like tenant-provided documents, but these must be documented as well. Now, let's talk about audit trails. An audit trail is basically a record of everything that's been done in the verification process. It's like a history of the case that any auditor or supervisor can look at and understand without needing extra explanations. Here's what needs to be included in that trail. Personal declarations, like we discussed earlier, should be completed during eligibility, annual recertifications, and interim recertifications. Interview documentation. If you have interviews with the family, make sure to document those. Third-party verification. Keep all records of income and deductions from third-party sources as part of your audit trail. Let's dig into the EIV system. This is a really powerful tool used by PHAs to track tenant income and benefits. It gets data from the Social Security Administration and the Department of Health and Human Services. The EIV system helps identify issues like discrepancies in tenant-reported income, unreported employment, and even tenants receiving benefits after they've passed away. It's mandatory for PHAs to use EIV during re-examinations, as per 24 CFR 5.233. Not using EIV could result in corrective actions, which no one wants. There are some important regulations to keep in mind when it comes to verifications. 24 CFR 982.516 and 960.259. This requires third-party verification of income, assets, and deductions. PIH Notice 2010.19. This mandates the use of EIV to reduce subsidy errors. 24 CFR 84.62. This outlines the consequences of failing to use EIV. 24 CFR Section 960.259c. 1. This provides exceptions when third-party verification isn't available. So, make sure you're familiar with these requirements and follow them carefully. Finally, let's wrap up with consequences and best practices. If verifications aren't done properly, it can lead to lower HUD scores. Poor verification practices can hurt your HUD ratings, which can affect your program's performance. Audit findings. Missing documentation or improper verification can trigger audit findings. Subsidy payment errors. If income verification is incorrect, it could result in overpayments or underpayments of subsidies. To avoid these issues, here are some best practices. 1. Staff training. Make sure all staff are trained on proper verification techniques and HUD guidelines. 2. Quality control. Implement internal reviews to catch errors before audits. 3. Documentation. Always maintain clear and complete documentation of all verification steps. Following these best practices ensures compliance with HUD regulations, prevents fraud, and protects the integrity of housing programs.